Well, morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. And we'll get started slowly here as people continue to dial in. Today, we are going to be looking at how to protect Automate with a WAF. These principles will apply to any WAF solution, but along the way, we'll go ahead and describe the automation theory WAF add-on for our proxy service. Couple points of order. This webinar is being recorded, and we will have time for questions at the end, so feel free to make use of that Q&A box. We have a little bit of a mixed audience, so we'll cover some background, and then we'll jump into all of the crunchy technical bits of how WAF works and how to protect Automate with it. So let's get started. To get some introductions out of the way, I'm Jeremy, the founder of Automation Theory. We specialize in Automate infrastructure. We're a small consulting firm, and we strive to take care of your Automate servers so you can take care of your clients. Our smaller size lets us actually get to know our clients and their needs and business models well. And we have skin in the security game ourselves. We use the same technologies that we show here to protect our own stacks and systems. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about Automate. So before we protect an Automate server, we need to understand the attack surface. There are multiple technologies that are clumped together in an Automate server. First up, you have your agent communications. Then you have your user interfaces, and you have both a REST API and a SOAP API mixed in there. And this broad surface area gives Automate a lot of surface to protect. And unfortunately, there aren't any native defenses out of the box. We'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. The other thing to note is that RMM traffic contains a lot of things that a WAF would block by default, like command line scripting. So with that, let's take a look at a default IIS server. So this is the report of a WAF testing tool run against a regular Automate server IIS stack. As you can see, there are no protections out of the box for the actual application. IIS and Windows are protected via Windows Update for exploits like against IIS itself, but IIS doesn't understand your application. Its role is not to be a WAF, and so that means that anyone with a 0-day attack against the application can just go ahead and try it. And traditional security technologies aren't going to pick up against that until the later stages of an attack. And this is where the WAF comes into play. It's designed to be that first layer of defense for the application. So with that, let's jump into the definition of what a WAF is. In a nutshell, WAFs provide deep inspection of web requests, and they compare them against rule sets for common exploits. A WAF is going to look at all parts of the HTTP request, everything from the headers to the cookies to the payload and everything else in between. And it's looking for things like protocol anomalies, malicious user agents like you'd see from bots or exploit tools, things like that. And then injection attacks, file inclusion, cross-site scripting, and everything else that you'd find in the OWASP top 10 vulnerability list. And these checks are going to be performed against every single request to your Automate server. So even if an attacker can maneuver around your other security controls, whether that be a GUIP or IP whitelisting or things like that, the requests are still going to be inspected for malicious content. Let's clear up one point before we dive into the bits and bytes of the WAF. One very common question that people ask is the difference between a WAF and a reverse proxy. And they do have similarities, but they are indeed different technologies. A reverse proxy is simply a web server that forwards requests to a different web server. As an example, if you have an old application running on some ancient Server 2003 box, you can put a reverse proxy in front of that, and that's running on an OS that is modern and secure, and you'd configure that to forward to your legacy application, and then you'd only have to allow one IP address to communicate with that old and secure server. And that's all you get with a plain Jane reverse proxy. The automation theory proxy service takes that basic proxy a step further, and we configure the additional security layers for common concerns for automate control servers. And so for anyone out there who might have a reverse proxy built from a community guide, something like that, you'll need to build in all those additional layers yourself. So the WAF comes in and provides a deep inspection of the inbound traffic and it inspects the payloads. And traditionally, a reverse proxy only looks down into the headers of the HTTP request. So this deeper inspection allows it to protect against attacks in the actual content, like a SQL injection in agent communication. Let's take a look at how a layer like this fits into the bigger security picture. In our previous webinar on reverse proxies, we covered how a proxy can be used to provide protection against reconnaissance and weaponization, with a few bits of delivery protection as well. A WAF picks up right where the reverse proxy leaves off with delivery and exploitation protections. So at the delivery phase, the WAF is going to be looking for and blocking common indicators of malicious requests, whether that be user agents, content types, etc. At the exploitation phase, the WAF is inspecting for those actual malicious payloads, and it's going to block a variety of attacks, even if the application itself is actually vulnerable. And last but not least, it is worth noting that the amount of protection offered does vary based on the actual solution implemented and the options chosen with that implementation style. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at delivery. So attackers will often fit into certain profiles based on the tools they use. One of the characters on the slide here looks a little suspicious. Just like the stereotypical bad guy has certain characteristics like the dark clothing, the mask, etc., and is easy to identify, so too are certain delivery tools and techniques used in common attacks. So let's look at a real-life example of this. So here, we make a web request to automate with our user agent set as an nmap scan. As you can see, the server replies back to us 200 OK, and you can see in the screenshot there that it also replies with the redirect to WCC2. Obviously, from a security perspective, that's not what we want. So let's take a peek at what the WAF does. Here, we make that same exact request through a reverse proxy equipped with a WAF. The WAF did spot that malicious user agent and responded with a 403 code. And as you can see, it didn't actually reply back with server details. It wasn't going to redirect you to the actual application or anything like that. This is a simple example, but it does demonstrate the core concept of how a WAF can block delivery of attacks. But additionally, WAFs can also block exploits. Let's take a look at that. So the true value in a WAF is the exploit prevention. In a nutshell, we've discussed, you can take an application that's vulnerable to injection, inclusion, or any other host of vulnerabilities. Once it's behind a WAF, those attacks will be blocked, even if the vulnerability isn't patched. As you can imagine, that's very helpful in protecting against zero-day vulnerabilities, since it's based off their tactics and not a specific vulnerability definition. Let's do a little bit of a demo with this with the SQL query above. And that SQL query, if it looks familiar, it comes from a different webinar of ours. And that would run an encoded PowerShell command on every computer in the Automate database, but don't worry, it's not actually malicious, just an inert payload here. So here we took a normal agent communication payload just from agents sending inventory, back and forth, and we added that malicious SQL to it after a little bit of URL encoding. And there are two things that are really interesting here. First, the application responded with a 200 OK code to essentially what's a malformed request. Secondly, it didn't even bat an eyelid at the encoded SQL in that payload. And again, this is expected for a default IIS server. It's not really aware of the application running inside and all of that. The other thing that we really want to make note of here is that protecting that agent communication traffic is especially important because that's the one part of Automate that does need to be open. Through other technology layers, we can provide protection for different parts of Automate, whether that's IP restrictions or any other host of technologies. But as those layers are increasingly adopted, attackers will go after what will become the soft underbelly of the agent requests. So with that, let's see what happens when we send this request to the WAF. And here you can really see the WAF shine. It detected that malicious payload and blocked it. And this was a previously unseen request. And the WAF was able to match it against the SQL injection rules and block that request in 226 milliseconds. And the protections of the WAF will apply to the entire surface area of the application, from the APIs to the control center, to the web UIs, the agent communications, and the integrations too. And that makes it an extremely valuable security layer. However, it's not without certain drawbacks. Due to the nature of RMMs, you need adjustments out of the box to the WAF rules. PowerShell commands are a good example. For any normal web server, you'd want to block anything with shellcode in it. It'd be an attack, someone trying to execute that code on your server. In the case of an RMM, you're sending, PowerShell maintenance scripts out to all of your remote agents, and you need to tune those rules accordingly. However, you have to be careful with that and make sure that it's not too broad of a tuning, since you still want to protect the Automate server against shellcode attacks. It's very much akin to whitelisting the entire Windows temp folder in your endpoint security solution. That obviously would be something where it's too broad of a stroke and you'd allow malicious code to run, because it'd create that kind of Swiss cheese security exclusion. Also, an important point is how a WAF is deployed can have impacts on the functionality of the application and how maintainable the actual WAF solution is. And let's take a little bit of a look at complex deployment here. So this is a screenshot that we pulled off the MSP Geek forums of an Azure implementation for a WAF. This diagram has 9 different moving parts, and it's sending traffic to 2 different places. And that will either break Heartbeat or SSO. And in this example, it's SSO that's sacrificed. The other thing to note here would be those disabled rules. We don't know for sure, but it looks like there are 8 rules that have been disabled for the whole application, and then a global whitelist is given for the desktop control center traffic. Now, those disabled rules include things for protocol validation, remote code execution, cross-site scripting, and SQL injection checks. So there are certain exclusions that do need to be made. In our WAF solution, we're up to about 70 custom rules to make sure that the application still works as expected. But it's much better to make those exclusions for the specific requests, like, for example, the agent traffic that will trigger cross-site scripting rules, instead of removing the protection for all of the application. As mentioned, we take that granular approach, which brings us to pure automation theory. We're happy to announce that we offer WAF as an add-on for our reverse proxy service. Like our proxy, it's a managed service specifically designed for Automate, where we take care of the backend hosting, maintenance, and rule tuning. We've designed it to be really plug and play, and we can deploy it fairly rapidly. The service eliminates all the complexities of managing your own WAF, and it also supports all the features of Automate, including Heartbeat and SSO. Additionally, the rule tuning is very granular, as we mentioned, so you don't have a Swiss cheese WAF. And that's important because the rules that are most likely to cause false positives, like your SQL injection rules, are the ones most critical to securing Automate. Here is how our deployment model works. So we start with your reverse proxy, and that gives you a second FQDN for your Automate server. You start with gradually testing that with a little bit of traffic, and if you decide that the solution is a good fit, eventually you'll migrate everything over to that. From there, we configure the proxy to send the traffic to a WAF cluster, and that replies back to the proxy with a score, a lot like a spam filter. From there, the proxy will either forward the request to the Automate server, or it'll reject it. As mentioned in the proxy webinar, there are multiple deployment methods. If you have an architecture that allows for secure access to your Automate, whether that's an existing VPN, RDS, AVD, or whatever your favorite remote access technology is, then you can deploy the proxy in agent-only mode, and then all the external agent requests go to your proxy, and then your staff accesses Automate directly. And so otherwise, in a default deployment of the proxy, all parts of Automate are available, and from there we can create ACLs, and those can be built to meet your specific business needs, whether you want to only allow logins from certain IPs, any additional GeoIP restrictions, we can add some authentication parameters, etc. So let's look at how effective this deployment model is and how the proxy layers tie into it. So this is the after result of that WAF test that we showed at the beginning, and it's much better than the beginning 27.5% score of a plain IIS server. However, it's really the combination of security layers in concert that creates the true protection. As we have discussed and blogged about in the past, an Automate stack can be enumerated very easily. By default, you can attack it from anywhere in the world, and it's more susceptible to client-side attacks without the header and cipher hardening. So you can fix these items individually, and that's all in well and good. But addressing it holistically means that if there's a would-be attacker, they have to, A, know your obfuscated FQDN, since they can't be bulk enumerated through IP scanning, certificate lookups, or DNS brute forcing. B, they have to launch the attack inside a GeoIP scope, most likely against the Automate server itself. C, after that, they have to attack whatever parts of the application that aren't protected by your custom ACLs. And D, they have to evade the WAF scanning for malicious payloads. So, full disclaimer, no security layer is a silver bullet, and a properly configured WAF will make your server exceedingly difficult to exploit. The risk of attack drops significantly, and it's relatively low cost and easy to implement. But there are a few other benefits to our solution as well. So besides the effective implementation, our proxy and WAF combination has a few non-functional perks. The biggest differentiator is that we understand the Automate application, and we can corroborate the application layer symptoms with potential causes inside your security stack. If you have a third-party WAF provider and tell them, hey, my computer screen won't load in web, that's not going to mean a lot to them, but we know exactly what that is, and where to start troubleshooting. Similarly, we focus on the MSP space and understand how these applications are used, and that enables us to understand individual business impact for our clients and advise usage and deployment accordingly. We also have a self-service API and plugin, and that enables our clients to self-diagnose and resolve most common issues without needing to engage with our support. And last but not least, that self-service integration is in the process of being certified by ConnectWise, and I'm happy to announce that we just passed our technical review. So it is all downhill from there. And that gives us access to the Automate development team, and we can quickly resolve issues with them should anything arise in the future. With that, the rest of the time is open for questions. This slide is taken from our reverse proxy webinar as an example of how the reverse proxy itself is deployed. So with that, let me pop over to Q&A. And it looks like we do have a question or two. So first question is, what is the deployment process if you already have a reverse proxy? And the good news is that it's pretty simple. What we do, if we don't have a proxy cluster in your geographic location already, we'll provision that on the back end. Then we set up an encrypted tunnel between your proxy and the cluster. After that, we will run for 7 days in essentially a read-only mode, and we'll spot check for any false positives in the specific integrations you're using. Just as an example, one of our beta clients added control to their proxy while they were doing the beta test of the WAF, and the PowerShell rules triggered for IMIBot. And so if you're using any integrations out there, we'll give it that 7-day period. After that, we essentially flip a switch, and the proxy will start to block requests based off of the WAF scoring. So, any other questions out there? Give everybody a minute or two if they want to send anything in. But otherwise, we are happy to go ahead and get trials set up for the WAF. You can request that on our website or existing clients. You're always welcome to put in a ticket. We can get that set up in short order for you. And as always, if you have any questions, you know where to find us. So with that, it looks like there aren't a lot of other questions. Actually, one more question did come in asking about running the WAF on-prem. And to answer that question, our service isn't set up for alternate deployment models. It's a very common question with the proxy, and it is tightly integrated into the backend hosting environment we have as part of our provisioning process. And so we don't actually have a product that can be lifted and shifted into alternate hosting. And as far as the WAF component specifically, you do want the WAF running right next to your proxy just for the latency, because otherwise, as those web requests come in, it will hit the proxy, reverse back to your on-prem scoring, reply back, and then route the traffic through. So you're doing some very large loops and you'd have a lot of application layer latency. So I wouldn't recommend moving the WAF away from the proxy. Let's see. Any other questions out there? Well, at this point, as always, if there are any other questions down the road, you know where to find us. Our email connector is going to be support@automationtheory.org. And with that, thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of your day.